I'm Baan, founder and president of TalaTek, a server sentinel company. And with me here today is Chris Stevens. He is the research director of security and risk management from the industry analyst firm Enterprise Management Associates, also known as EMA. You can find Chris on LinkedIn and follow him on Twitter at EMA_research. Welcome, Chris. So happy to have you here on our first quarterly Zoomcast.
And hello, great to be here.
Oh, so we can mute our social media and texts and all that. So Chris, today we're going to talk a lot about risk management, and kind of me and you could talk about that for maybe 60 minutes.
We have already once or twice or three times before. So yeah, absolutely.
We can make it happen in like 60 minutes or 15 minutes. But I really would like to start with you on obviously this is what you do for a living. You've been in the analysis business for more than 2 decades. You're an expert in risk and regulatory compliance space, working with all size organizations, including Fortune 500 to a small business such as TalaTek. So to start, kind of to set the framework for the conversation, can you share with us what you're catching as kind of trends that are in the regulatory and risk management space these days?
Yeah, the big one, and I think this isn't really news to anybody, is that risk and compliance is not going away. We've all been through the pandemic. We're still going through the pandemic. And as much as we'd like to think that those regulators are going to give us a break, which, by the way, some of them actually did have a heart for about 2 seconds and give companies, a chance to not go out of business before coming back and regulating them again. But it isn't going away. And I think there was the thought for the longest time that, risk and compliance and regulatory standards were the purview of those big Fortune 500 companies, those banks and highly regulated industries. And while that's certainly the case, that certainly has not lessened. The small to medium-sized companies are really starting to take a hit from compliance and risk-related activities. All of your passed down compliance, which is a term that I've used for a while now, is really starting to hit. But what I mean by that is that you have the biggest banks that you can think of, for example, they've been regulated by every acronym that you can imagine, and now the companies that are doing business with those companies are now the ones being regulated. Well, if you're one of these ginormous banks and you have $50 billion a year in revenues or whatever, it's part of doing business, right? And it's costing them a fortune. I'm not trying to say any of that, but if you're Bob's House of Paperclips and you've done business with one of these big banks since the time of George Washington, it's very difficult. You aren't a technology firm, you are a paperclip firm. And trying to understand regulatory frameworks and how it applies to what you're doing every day, it can be really difficult. So anyway, long story short, those things are really front and center. You're seeing these companies that are not only the big companies, but the small companies looking for ways to meet this regulatory compliance and looking for talent to help them meet this regulatory compliance.
Isn't it also true that the fact that COVID itself introduced more challenges and exposure for even small businesses, right?
Yeah,
they're not prepared to work remote. They don't have the infrastructure, the technology. They don't have VPN set up, et cetera. So really, COVID introduced even more challenges in the last year.
Yeah, no question about it, right? So, most companies ended up taking and having a work from home component. Some companies had a certain amount of remote working before the pandemic, which was great. But now they're realizing that 100% working remote workforce has challenges, and there are hundreds. And I actually just did a pandemic report that people can go find at the EMA website, but I will share one that is particularly obvious, and that's the one on data privacy and data security. When you start talking about data privacy and data security, people lived with this belief, whether it was true or not, and generally not true, that all their data was in this little nice self-contained basket. That is obviously no longer the case. You have people taking in and working from everywhere. There's two different ways to look at it. One is the regulatory way. All that data is regulated by, either the GDPR or CCPA, and needs to be managed and needs to be dealt with, and who can access it, and so on and so forth. And that's relatively well known. They're still taking and looking at CCPA and GDPR for guidance and what it's going to mean, so on and so forth. And we can talk about that ad nauseum. The second way of looking at it is from the vendor side. And most people, whether you realize it or not, as part of your vendor due diligence, had a vendor assessment that came in and said, we're expecting you to take care of the data that you have from us, and we expect you to take care of it in this way. And it may have regulations about who can access it, when they can access it, how it has to be recorded, so on and so forth. There's a pretty good chance that you were doing a lot of those things before, but now that you're working 100% remote, there's a chance that you're not doing all those things before. And whereas the governmental regulators are giving people a little bit of a break, vendors are not, because they're feeling pressure from on top of them to make certain that that data remains secure. So that is absolutely something that needs to be considered in the small to medium-sized business space. It didn't magically go away, and it's something that the small and medium-sized businesses not only need to consider, but really need some help with.
I can actually speak of firsthand experience because TalaTek has always been a remote virtual company. So when COVID hit as a company, all our resources were in different states, even within the state in different locations. So we had, over the years, really had put in all the controls that are necessary to put in place, but it didn't happen overnight. So the challenges for anybody who's trying, one day you have the enterprise culture, if you will, and you go to an office, to suddenly you're working from home 100%, introduce tremendous challenges. Honestly, everything from awareness to, hey, don't click on that phishing email, to are you sharing your laptop with your kid during the day? and
ransomware didn't go down, right? Ransomware continues to increase, and then I'll speak to myself personally here, but very few people that I know, apart from myself, have a enterprise grade network at their house that's separated and nerdy and everything else. But really, who does that, right? Who has a router and honeypots and firewalls and so on and so forth at their home network only for their business? And the answer to that question is very few people. A lot of times you see the kids taking and playing their Xbox on the exact same computer network that your business is running on, and so on and so forth. And I'm not trying to say that there's any kind of particular vulnerability about playing Xbox or PlayStation on your network. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. My point is that, that latency that you have when your kids are doing stuff, that, those problems that you sometimes see, plus any other computers that they attach that are not nearly as clean or corporate managed as your computer might be, are all potential threats. And so if your kid goes and has his gaming laptop, connects it to your network, it has some kind of virus, it attacks your computer. Now all the data that you had on your computer, or the computer it can attach to, now has the potential of being exposed. So again, I'm not trying to come up with convoluted situations. I'm talking about things that I'm hearing about in real life. And so these are things that, again, are all part of that whole conversation about how to deal with remote working. And we're still figuring it out. The good news is that we are figuring it out. We are figuring out little bits at a time. But as you mentioned, Baan, we still probably have a bit to go. It's not something that happens immediately overnight.
I have a funny story to share about the home computer and sharing the network. One, obviously, we all know that not only we're working from home, our kids are studying at home. Mm-hmm. Our spouses who probably went to the office are now working from home. So, but my funny story is that I recently decided to get a camera to watch the bird feeder under the deck.
Yes, absolutely.
And the camera that watches the bird feeder streams to some site somewhere, who knows where, and anybody from anywhere could log in and look at the bird feeding activity. Yeah. And so to your point, which is some people have really advanced network setups, we were able to create a VLAN and separate it to its own SSID. Yep. And therefore, it's not really connecting to my corporate laptop. and which brought to my thinking that, people at home probably are using default password on their routers, or don't have the savviness
I
to
sure hope
manage.
I sure hope they change it from the default. Let's just hope that, right?
I
So,
know, but these are challenges that we don't even have, not even tackled, and we don't even have the resources or the bandwidth to tackle those.
that's
They're
right.
very real.
Yeah, and like I said, you get a certain amount of leeway from regulators and hopefully auditors that maybe just for a moment remember their humanity for a moment. But the reality of it is that even if you are given a little bit of leeway, it is something you got to figure out sooner than later. It is something that has the potential of increasing your overall risk score for your company. And so to come full circle, what we're talking about at the end of the day is risk, right? Is it riskier for your CEO to be working from his basement or working in the office in a more controlled environment? And without trying to get any kind of particular statistics or so on and so forth, I think that we can all agree that him working remotely probably increases the overall risk for the company. But there's 100 different ways that you can mitigate some of those risks, and we're starting to figure them out. We're starting to take and get the situation under control enough that we are able to mitigate those risks and do what's right by our customers and employees.
Absolutely. And really, this kind of brings to my mind the hopefully this is no longer the case, but still in the industry largely, when we talk about risk management and we talk about compliance, we almost are talking about two different things. Most organizations, and correct me if I'm wrong, their main objective is to kind of satisfy the regulators and the auditors. And in their minds, that not necessarily is, if it's a Venn diagram, they're not overlapping with risk management.
Yeah.
So if we want to talk about that, kind of how would you advise the industry and people who are listening to, hey, how do you correlate these two activities, one and the same, right?
Yeah, boy, you couldn't be more right, and I wish it wasn't that way. People have talked about checkbox compliance now for decades, and quite frankly, it hasn't gone away. People are taking and doing the absolute bare minimum that they need to do. In fact, in that pandemic study that I just released, I did ask the question: when you take a look at your regulatory compliance and your security controls, I asked very specifically, do you believe that the regulatory control frameworks that you adhere to are enough for your everyday enterprise security strategy? And when asked, they said yes, overwhelmingly. And then I started asking specifics like, do you believe that PCI controls are enough? And the answer for 83% of them, or 85% of them, was yes, that they believe that PCI was the absolute pinnacle of what they needed to do for security. Now, as a security person, we know that that's not the case. And the PCI Council will tell you that. Anybody that deals with that every day will tell you that. But it talks about the education process that we, as an industry of security people, really do need to take and continue pushing forward, that there is more to it. When it comes to separating risk and compliance, again, it's a lot of people are looking at it from the same hat, and we know that it's not. It's a matter of getting them to a maturity level where they understand that you got to do one and then you got to do the other, and yes, both. You have to do both. It's going to take some time. I think companies are starting to get it. We have to get them there, kicking and screaming a lot of times. But I do think that overall, I think it is starting to work and make sense as people become more and more aware of these security frameworks and the importance of risk management and governance as part of their overall program.
And not only everything that you said, which is absolutely correct, but they not only have to manage that for them, and the suppliers are looking at them, like you mentioned earlier. So for instance, CMMC right now is the DoD is pushing it down the chain. So if you're a large DoD contractor and then you have some vendors that provide you anything from screws to, little pieces, parts, all of you across the chain are required to meet regulatory requirements. So I could connect that to the SolarWinds story as far as supply chain goes. Talk to us about tips about managing third party and how in this really interconnected, hyper-connected world, how can we manage that effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about pass down compliance from before it was ever even a thing, and you are hearing more and more of it. Just like with the government that you just talked about. The really important part for people to do from the very beginning is to establish a vendor due diligence program. It isn't easy, but it doesn't have to be overly complicated. And there's a lot of different services out there that can help you do this kind of thing. Really trying to engage and understand what the requirements, what you need your requirements to be, then what is reasonable to expect that your vendors be able to do. That's a really important place to start. You can get really tricky and complicated and all those things after, and feel free. I mean, that's what makes the world go round, I guess. But when it's all said and done, start with the basics, understand what the basics that you're going to need are, from really probably from a data perspective, from a risk perspective, understanding what they are doing for your company, what value are they adding, and let them know what your expectations are. 9 times out of 10, the bigger companies will have already thought a bit about this and already have some suggestions as to what they are willing to provide and do as part of a vendor due diligence exam. And then when it's all said and done, again, depending on your industry, you can engage that third party to conduct audits for you, to help you walk through compliance related activities, to help you understand what some of these activities are going to do. Baan, do you know of any companies that might do that?
I don't know. You could read the logos on the screen and make a smart deduction from here. We have very little time left, but I honestly, you touched on it briefly, and maybe within 2 minutes, you talked about simplifying the process. And largely it's overwhelming for businesses to think they have to do these massive programs and do a lot of things. But honestly, they could do like 5 good things, and that would resolve 80% of their risk topics. What would these be if you were to kind of off the top of your head?
Yeah, and that's totally true. Like I said, you want to have a very firm data inventory. Understanding your data estate is extremely complicated, but it doesn't have to be. And you got to start. I know one of the things that freaks out people the most about CCPA and GDPR is some of the requirements that are around data inventory and data estate. Trying to get a handle on that is not necessarily an easy task, but you got to start somewhere. And getting started is a great way to do. Another thing that I would highly recommend is don't do this alone. There are plenty of very qualified resources out there that can help you navigate vendor due diligence, compliance, those sort of activities, and really help you identify and quantify the risks to your organization. Don't reinvent the wheel. If you're not an expert at this, and chances are you probably aren't, it probably makes a lot of sense to try to find some help. And so those are the 2 things that I would immediately recommend for anybody. Don't do it alone, and try to get a handle of what your data infrastructure, your data estate really looks like.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was a lot of
Absolutely.
fun, and I know we can do it again, hopefully soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
I'm Baan Alsinawi, founder and president of TalaTek, a Cerberus Sentinel company. Joining me today was Chris Steffen, director of research and enterprise management associates. You can find Chris on LinkedIn and follow him on Twitter at EMA_research. You can listen to our new quarterly Zoomcast soon, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.